Let's get started. I'm Rinku Gupta. I am a research software specialist at Argonne National Lab. And today we will be talking about Agile. So this is a 30-minute talk. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat window and we can get to them. This is a mandatory license slide. So what are we going to cover in this talk? We will first talk about Agile methods, especially in the context of small teams. I'll talk about what is Agile, what is the terminology, what are the approaches we follow, or what are the tools and basic methods to actually get started with it. So small teams, let's first explore ideas for managing transitions and steady work in small teams. So we have a lot of different variety of attendees out here, and a lot of us work with small teams very frequently. Small teams, as the name says, are small, which means in an academic setting there might be one faculty member or a PI and several junior members, which may be postdocs or students, uh, depending on the environment. The roles of the senior and the junior staff differ. The senior staff usually provides a stable presence. They are going to be around for a long time, sometimes for the whole length of the career if they are in an academic setting. The junior staff may be there for a shorter period of time, maybe until they complete their education. They may come and go more frequently. Now, the senior staff are the ones who actually, provide the vision, and they are the ones who can see the forest from the actual, trees. They see the broad picture, but rarely have the time to sit and write code. And it's mostly the junior staff that actually does the code writing, knows all the lower level technicalities and details. So now, small teams, usually small teams have an informal structure and less clearly defined processes in place. And if even if you choose to adopt a process that works for large teams or industry or enterprise environments, they end up being very, very heavyweight and not really needed for small teams. So in addition to this, there are other challenges, right? There is in small teams, there's a constant influx of people coming, influx of people, outflux of people, getting out. Newcomers have to ramp up quickly so that they are able to contribute quickly. And when they are ready to depart, they have to somehow share that information, uh, or the group has to retain the information that they have gathered because they're the ones who, as I said, they're the ones who are actually writing the code. So there are a lot of there are a lot of challenges that small team face. See, this slide out here shows the life cycle of a typical research team member. So, you have an initiation setup, which is when, that's the initial phase where the team member joins, he or she starts ramping up. The ramping up time may depend on how effective your ramp up process is, how much experience that your team member has. So it can vary quite considerably. The next phase is when the team members are actually working, which you see in the ongoing work section of this chart. When they are working, they are writing code, they are contributing actively. When they are ready to exit, there should always be a, a, a final deliverable or an exit checklist or a ramp down path, so that all the contributions are retained by the team, and that there is a way to train a replacement team member as well. So when a new person joins in, essentially this cycle is repeated. One way to deal with some of the challenges that small team face are to have something called as checklists and policies in place. So what is a checklist? A checklist is like a to-do list. And on this slide out here on the right-hand side, you see a checklist that is taken, I think, from the Trillinos project. Uh, and it's basically an onboarding checklist. That is when a team member joins, what all things they should do to onboard and integrate with the team. So that's the example out here. In general, having a checklist is good because essentially you are documenting the process. And if you are missing something in the process, then you can simply go ahead, improve your checklist, and then automatically your process itself is getting improved. Now, what kind of checklist you want is totally dependent on you and your team. You can have onboarding checklist, offboarding checklist. You can have checklist for code development, code reviews. So basically, it's up to you and your team as to what checklist you really want. I also mentioned policies. That's another way to maintain consistency. An example out here with a link talks about the SDK project, which has community policies, which ensures consistency not only within one project, but across the entire math library community. Okay, next slide. So now let's talk about Agile. What is Agile? Agile, Agile is used quite frequently in the scientific domain. In the scientific domain, you don't really know when you will have a breakthrough. You're working on stuff and suddenly you get great results. And when you have a breakthrough, your work pattern will change because, hey, now you need to publish the results, present the results, and so on. So the pattern of work has changed. So when you have heavyweight techniques or approaches, they may not again really work for scientific domains. Now with Agile, if you are a small team, you can pick and choose as to what kind of processes you really want to adopt, what is meaningful, what is improving productivity, what is improving sustainability, what is improving communication in a team. So instead of adopting like a wide variety of processes that are not beneficial to you, you can actually choose what you want with Agile. So what exactly? Let's talk about what is Agile and what it is and what it is not. So Agile is not a software development life cycle model. It's not like the waterfall model that you might have learned in your software engineering books, or it's not an iterative model. It doesn't have different phases that a conventional software development life cycle model has. Many times people do informal work, sloppy work, and then they say that, hey, I'm doing this by following Agile. So Agile is again what it's not. It's not an excuse for to do bad work or sloppy work because that's clearly not acceptable. And then there are certain class of people who think Agile is the same as Scrum. Scrum is a framework that helps teams work together. It's very widely used in the industry. So Scrum is definitely Agile, but Agile is not just Scrum. There are other Agile methods that exist, and Scrum just happens to be one of them. And speaking of Scrum, Scrum is definitely a very good framework for people who use it, but its applicability in scientific domain is debatable. It's not been explored much. People actually prefer something called Kanban, which we will discuss in some of the latter slides. So this slide out here is the Agile Manifesto slide. And we put this slide out here because if you look at the Agile Manifesto, it clearly tells you what Agile is all about. And it's pretty interesting and not really like this boring piece of literature. It's very clearly defined and very easy to read. To understand what the Agile Manifesto is, go to the agilemanifesto.org website and read the manifesto. The manifesto has four critical components that you see in the above the red box. And I don't know why my red box is a little displaced on my slide, but the four critical components are individual and interactions over processes and tool. Another says working software is more important than comprehensive documentation. Now, these four components, it doesn't mean that when you say working software is important over comprehensive documentation, it doesn't mean that one can use Agile as an excuse for not writing documentation. Right? What the red box that is not highlighted properly, that red box actually says that while there's value in the items on the right-hand side, we value the items on the left-hand side more. So there is value in having documentation, but having a working software is valued more. And there's value in following a plan, but responding to change quickly is valued more in Agile. So you have to balance both the left hand and the right hand side and ensure that the right hand side is not disregarded. So if you're serious about Agile, take a look at the Agile Manifesto and the four main components. Agile also has 12 principles. So these are, I think, the next two slides. Yep. The next two slides talk about the 12th principle. I don't think we have time to go over all of them, but just to highlight a few. The first principle says that our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. This principle is important because this is what Agile actually focuses on. When you are implementing software, the software should be given to stakeholders early and frequently. Uh, and what happens is that a lot of the older software development lifecycle processes, they need a lot of time investment. They need a lot of time for designing and developing, implementing, testing software. And eventually, when the software is ready, a lot of time has passed, requirements have changed, and the target requirement has changed. You have new architectures, and therefore there's a lot of force fitting that goes on for to make the stakeholders happy. So Agile tries to circumvent this by saying that have the software out to the customers as early as you can, as frequently as you can. The second principle says we welcome changing requirements even late in development. So again, this does not mean that hey, anybody can walk in the door and say that uh, you know change this requirement, change that requirement frequently. What it means is that Agile does offer a way to change requirement. And again, this goes back to the first point where we are saying that as time passes, architectures and target environments and priorities change, and so there should be a way to get these changing requirements into the code, and that's what the second principle is all about. So take a look at all these other very nice principles that are listed out here. Uh, a lot of items out here are highlighted in red. As you see, they are like keywords that such as sustainable development or team reflecting on how to become more effective. These are all excellent principles and definitely worth your time if you are serious about Agile. Now, getting started with Agile, one thing I want to point out about the 12 principles of Agile is that none of the principles are like hard and fast rules. The basic philosophy is that instead of following a rigid framework that is ill-fitting, that if you're following for a really long time, it might lead to frustration and bad code and failure. It's good to investigate some of these Agile principles and adopt them if they are suitable. And the way we do this, and that the way I've seen this implemented is that a team, you sit with your team, you pick up a practice, and and then see what is working for your team, what is resonating with your team. Try it out for a couple of weeks, couple of months. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't work, then you move on. One thing I want to mention is again Kanban, because Kanban is a very good starting framework. You can start with following the basic principles of Kanban, which we'll discuss in one of the later slides, and then you can add practices whenever you think you need, much better practices. And following Kanban is something like Kanban is perhaps more advantageous than following something else, which might be force fitting in some scientific environments. You know. So let's talk a bit about Kanban. To jump to the basics, what is this slide out here shows a Kanban board. And when I think of Kanban in very beginner terms, I think of it as a very sophisticated to-do list. That is, if I had all the tasks that are running around in my life right now, if I take them and put them on a board, then it would look exactly like a Kanban board with different columns. So every scientific project has tasks that can be segregated into different columns, like the ones you see on the slide out here. You always have a backlog of things to do. You will always have in progress tasks. You will always have a done column. That is a list of things that you have accomplished. And then you can have other things like ready for development, items in review, and so forth. So you can be as creative as you want with your columns. What you see out here is just an example. And we have since a lot of your students, one of our interns had mentioned how they were using Kanban board, and they actually had a column said waiting for advisor or blocked by advisor, if you're waiting for tasks coming from your advisor or something like that. So it's up to you as to how you want to design your Kanban board. So I mentioned that there were some Kanban principles. So the Kanban principles are very simple, and it basically says that this board is used for you to make progress in life on your project, whether the project is your entire life or whether the project is your multiple projects at work. So there are always things in progress going on. And one of the principles is that you limit the number of tasks in the in progress column. In progress means tasks that have been actively worked on. And of course, that's specific to each team, but many times the recommendation is just to have two n minus one tasks, where n is the number of team members. Having such principles is good because if you have too many tasks that are in progress, then your team members are going to spend a lot of time context switching instead of actually making progress. So then the question of flexibility. How do you optimize flexibility versus context switching overhead that arises? And how do you make sure that your team members are not overly committed? So things of this sort becomes easier when you have a certain set of rules assigned to your in progress column, like 2n minus 1. One beauty of Kanban is that it can very easily expose bottlenecks, especially when it comes to productivity. For example, if you have a column named blocked where you're waiting for feedback from external collaborators, and if that column is full, then you know where your bottleneck is. The bottleneck is basically not getting timely feedback from collaborators. And once you've identified that, you can do something about it. So I think Kanban offers nice, beautiful flexibility and is therefore very effective in R&D settings because it avoids a deadline-based approach as compared to other tools such as maybe Scrum. It's really nice. It's a nice, elegant way of viewing tasks and it's pretty lightweight. So now Kanban, I put the slide is out here to make sure that you understand that Kanban doesn't have to be just used in your work environment. We can simply use it, we can use it and apply it to our personal life as well in exactly the same way. In fact, I use Kanban principles to manage aspects of my personal life on a daily basis. There's a book referenced out here called Personal Kanban, which is a very good read. Also, at this point, I want to reference the Better Scientific Software website, that is bssw.io website, which has a lot of articles on individual productivity, team productivity, using Kanban for productivity, and so on. So definitely good. There are good books out there. There are good websites like BSSW out there. So fine, now we understand kind of the theory of Kanban. What are the tools that we, if you want to get started with Kanban, how do we start with it? What are the common tools that you can use? Kanban is essentially a set of columns put together, right? So you can use your wall with post-its if you really don't have anything else handy. You can use your whiteboard and draw columns, blackboards. This is a basic approach. So if you want to get started right now, take your notebook and draw columns and just get started. But in addition to all this, there are definitely lots of different kinds of tools and software available. There's Trello that I personally use for managing segments of my individual life, and it's Jira. And if you use GitHub, then GitHub has something called as project board, and something like you can create issues in GitHub and then assign them to your project board, and that's Kanban. So there are different tools out there, a lot of tools if you want to start playing around and see where you go with it. So the question is that we spoke about in progress column, right? But how many tasks should you have on your overall board? There's no right or wrong answer for this. A couple of years back when I started with Kanban, I had like 10 tasks. And now I have like 35, 40 tasks on my work Kanban board. The freeway analogy is very applicable out here. Does you know does the what does it say? Does the traffic really flow fast when there are a lot of cars? So if you have a lot of tasks on your board or in your life, are you really making progress on all the tasks? Are you really being productive? So that's something to keep in mind when you're designing your board. One important point to consider is when you get started with Kanban, because honestly, it's all very exciting and so easy. One starts with a lot of enthusiasm, and one needs to make it a habit to consult the board, because as life progresses, you might stop using the board. But then, if you think you're dropping out of habit and haven't looked at the board for a long time, then just stop and go back to it and reanalyze the board. The board will bring into focus how well your team is progressing, what the bottlenecks are, how much free time your team is having, how overcommitted they are, and so on. Oops, next slide. There you go. So again, I want to just spend some time talking about the importance of the in progress concept for Kanban for you. So again, in our audience, we have students and we have young professionals who are starting their careers, and you may wonder, is Kanban of any use to me? And yes, Kanban is definitely of use to you, right? If you have a Kanban board, you can clearly see what items you are working on, what items are on the back burner. And let's say you are a PhD student and your advisor has given you a ton of tasks, and then something new and exciting comes up. If you have a systematic Kanban board, you have a clear picture of whether you have the time or the bandwidth to actually accept the task and execute it properly. If your in progress column is very full, then you're in a position to negotiate with the advisor or supervisor and convince them to move some tasks to the back burner so that you can focus on work that truly matters to you. So having a Kanban board will help improve efficiency and will actually help you use your time much more wisely, I think. Now that we have discussed basic Kanban, let's see how we can build upon it. So there are several common things that we can do to build on Kanban. The focus always, when you're using Kanban, should be on solving issues. One way you have, once you have the Kanban board ready, your team could have regular 15-minute stand-up meetings where people report on their progress quickly in the different columns of the Kanban board. Of course, you can have planning meetings to figure out, what actually goes on your board, what are the different columns, what do they mean. Now, another thing is the retrospective meetings. They are another great way of figuring out what you have done on your project, what things you could improve on, what things worked, what didn't work. We should I think on the next slide we will, or somewhere down the lane, we will look at epic story and tasks, and we will see where that fits with the Kanban board, because a lot of you and a lot of people working in academic scientific computing environments now use epic stories and tasks, or at least know of those words. Oh, here we are. So let's talk a bit about epic story and task. The I so Kanban board has different items on it that you prioritize in different columns, and these items could be like epic story and tasks. The idea of epic story task is that you start with the very high level requirements in your project, and then you break down those requirements and refine them only when you need to, and if you need to. So the reason for that is that you start with a high level requirement, and right in the start, if you start refining it, and then again as time passes, those refinements may get outdated, and therefore a lot of planning time that would have been wasted. So the recommendation is that if you need to refine requirements, do them, but closer to the start date of the individual elements. So between epic stories and tasks, epics are the high level objectives. These are like the very high level objectives. And if you refine the epic a little to a slight degree, you will get stories. Epic is, an epic usually has a couple of stories under it. And every story has a done criteria. The story needs to have an ending, right? So story has a done criteria, and that criteria is understandable by a user. You know when the story is done. You have a completion criteria type thing. This provides a lot of value add to the customer, because the customers, the stakeholders, the development team, they have a better understanding of what they're actually trying to do. Now, under story itself, the story can be broken down into tasks. And you can think of tasks as steps that are needed to be completed in order to complete a story. The tasks themselves are necessary, but the stakeholder customer doesn't usually have to know about them. They don't provide any value add, in telling the customer. But overall, they're an important part of the whole process. In terms of hierarchy, again, epics have multiple stories. Each story may have multiple tasks. And once the stories are marked done, you can consider your epic as done. So user stories are very important actually. Uh, so one way to define your epic and stories is to have user stories. And what user stories are easy for your customers and for the software development teams to understand actually. And usually the format of the user story is as it shows in the user story section of the slide. It says, as a team lead, I want to learn Kanban so that I can manage my team better. So it says, as a stakeholder, I want to do what is needed so that I can achieve this. Giving such a story, giving such a story helps, as I said, all parties to understand what the context is, and it also gives an opportunity to the development team to glean any additional high-level requirements in order to fulfill the goal more efficiently. There are some more examples out here, that talk about what a user story might look like. So this this slide out here is another example about how uh, you can take the epic and separate it out into stories. And we will discuss this particular thing a little more in the Agile Redux section that will be presented, I think, maybe after a couple of hours. This slide gives an example of a heap equation epic, and then it shows that, hey, how two stories are created from it, and then the stories can be used to you know improve your case with stakeholders and deal with staffing, funding issues, so on. This is an example of a Kanban board on the Collegeville website. It's a Collegeville school website. This example is just put here so that you can understand how Kanban boards can be designed. I think this is a GitHub board. So you can see backlog, ready, in progress, in review. Lots of columns. And I think a particular project team in Collegeville uses this board. All right, so Kanban and GitHub. We have a lot of GitHub users, I think, out here. One thing to mention is that Kanban does provide basic stuff. GitHub does provide basic stuff for Kanban boards. It doesn't have a variety of features, but the advantage is that Kanban boards are pretty simple. The learning curve is small, and therefore it's very good for small teams. If you're a team that already uses GitHub for your code development, then Kanban boards are totally worth exploring. This slide shows what we have in place, what our team has in place. It's called A-Team Tools. Is a collection of resources for understanding actual practices and seeing how it applies to your team. The URL out here will take you to where all this information and resources are stored. And then out here, we have some more resources, some more really nice books that are useful to help you get started on your Agile Kanban journey. I think that's the last slide. I'll stop. Hopefully you all heard me. I was not talking to myself.